So, hey, this is Jordan, the ancient literature dude, and I wanted to talk today about something that I've been seeing on Reddit and other language forums, which is the question of which language to study. And I wanted to talk about Greek and Latin in particular because they're languages that are near and dear to me, and they're also obviously languages that are often studied together and occupy a kind of a similar area of interest historically. So, one of the first questions that tends to be asked is about the relative difficulty of the language, say for a native English speaker. And in my experience, Greek tends to be a little bit more challenging initially. There are more sheer verb forms to memorize. You're looking at about 240 as compared to Latin's 120 or so fairly important verb forms that need to be memorized. Probably more importantly, Greek has many, many more irregular verbs, and they're fairly common. They're not something that can just be easily ignored. And unfortunately, in the beginning, you're either going to need to have a very good dictionary that includes all the variations, or you're going to be consulting grammars very frequently because it's a bit of a nightmare to figure out some of the irregular verbs. And in addition to that, Greek, of course, has the issue of dialect, whereas Latin tends to be more uniform in the way that it was written for the most part. Greek exhibits a high degree of dialectal variation in some of the most important literature. I mean, if you want to read Homer or Herodotus or Hesiod or especially the earlier Greek writers, but a lot of the other more important ones, you're going to face issues of dialect. Some of them are lesser than others, but it can be a little bit daunting, especially in the beginning. But once some of those difficulties have been overcome, I would say that ultimately both languages are just about equally difficult. Latin textually tends to be a little bit more difficult in my eyes. Latin writers tend to like to use really fun constructions like the ablative absolute and gerundives and things like that. That can be a little bit challenging, even at advanced levels of familiarity with the language. And so, for that reason, I would say that Latin probably tends to be a little bit more difficult to read in terms of the actual text, but in terms of learning each language, Greek is tougher to pick up in the beginning. Latin is probably a little bit more straightforward. Now, in terms of the reasons to learn the language, they both have a lot to offer, right? They both offer a lot in practical terms. There's some utility in learning each. Obviously, in English, our technical vocabulary tends to be highly Latinate. To a lesser extent, it comes from Greek. And of course, it depends on the particular field. But if you're interested in the sciences in any way, in engineering or the medical field, then both will be of a lot of value. I think Greek probably more so in medical terms, but you can't go wrong with Latin in terms of building technical vocabulary and having a little bit of a heads up on that kind of thing. But maybe more importantly, ultimately, there's the question of what kind of literature you're interested in, what your area of interest is in terms of what you want to do with the language once you've learned it. And both languages, of course, have a lot to offer. Greek is arguably more historically significant early on in terms of its impact on human culture and the future of literature in general. In that you have arguably the first major epic national poem to be composed by an author that can be tentatively identified as a single person in the Iliad with Homer. You have Herodotus, arguably the spearhead of our modern understanding of history. And you have the major philosophy that forms the foundation of Western civilization in many respects. But of course, Latin is extremely historically significant in its own way, especially going forward into the medieval era, and especially in Western Europe. And to give an example, in terms of my personal preferences, theologically, they both have a lot to offer, right? If you're interested in the New Testament in particular, Greek is probably the way to go, because it was probably the language of composition of the New Testament, and a lot of the very early, theological writings concerning it tend to be in Greek. But then again, once again, going forward, Latin was the language of the church in the medieval era. In those terms, it probably had a longer lasting effect. And there's a huge amount of interesting material in each. Again, I would say for very early theological material, Greek probably tends to be a little more significant. And in terms of the subsidiary stuff, the pseudepigrapha and the apocrypha, Greek was probably more important. But there are texts that remain in each language, even for those kind of obscure, pieces of literature. So, in any event, once again, I just wanted to give a brief summary of my thoughts on the benefits of each language, the difficulties involved. I know there's a little bit of ambiguity, but the truth is they're both difficult languages, but highly rewarding. For interested students, I would recommend each. Of course, studying them at the same time might be a little bit of a challenge, but anytime you come to them, they have a lot to offer. So yeah, anyway, just wanted to share my thoughts on that, and hope I talk to you all again soon, and hope you're doing well.